King, comfort of the Spirit, true to give word, President, full of all things, treasure, blessings, and giver of life. Come and abide us and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good. So, tonight what I basically want to talk about is the end of the 19th or early 20th century. I want to, focusing on America. Alexander, could you turn on the fans, please? And there's a really great promise here with an air conditioner sitting here waiting to be installed. I'm so happy about that.
What was the temperature in Michigan?
Yesterday it got up to, or no, day before yesterday it got up to 44.
Whoa! Were you in Traverse City or?
No, I was in the top in Houghton.
Oh, up there.
Way up there with the Yoopers.
It's over.
Nice.
Yeah, that was interesting. A great place, anyway. It's all Finns up there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but what I wanted to talk about is essentially St. Tikhon, his ministry, some of the things that happened, but also because he was core, and we got into it a bit last week. The setting up of a multi-ethnic jurisdictional structure. Now, there's and so there's also other elements like the whole Anglican thing, which is quite interesting. But it's also important to remember right now that the Russian Church established the canonical diocese here in San Francisco in 1872. You could say it was established with the missionaries in 1794 with St. Innocent in Sitka, but Sitka was not part of the United States at the time. But certainly San Francisco was well part of the United States by 1872. And by the end of this period, in other words, by the time of the Russian Revolution, there were over 600 parishes. So it was a quite substantial group of people.
Well, they were under Metropolitan Jonah, right?
Yes.
The one who became the patriarch.
Right. Though he was just a bishop at the time when he came. There were the early immigrants in, so far as the lower 48, Orthodox immigrants came from all over. But the largest groups were the Serbs and the Greeks and the Arabs earlier on, the Syrians, and then the Albanians, and then at the end of starting in the around 1880, I think, there was a huge immigration of Carpatho-Russians. Now, these were people from Austria-Hungary, what today is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, what today is Slovakia, but also from what today is Eastern Ukraine, Western Ukraine, Eastern Poland, and Moldavia, Moldova, Bessarabia, you know, all these areas that where the borders just went back and forth between the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire and the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, and you know, and then in the 20th century with Ukraine, and then you had the German invasion and twice, and so it was a oh, Benjamin. Good to see you. So this whole area of the northern Carpathian Mountains was on one hand was very dynamic. On the other hand, these were peasant cultures that were extremely stable, and the politics just kind of went over the top. They maintained the language. They maintained ancient linguistic, and their language was very close to Church Slavonic. They maintained practices from Constantinople, liturgical practices that were only used last in Constantinople in the 12th century. You know, it was the mountains shielded these people from a lot of the political and with its social and other kinds of changes, you know, of course, and the people were basically Orthodox, but you know, 1589 you had the Union of Brest and the creation of the Unia, the Greek Catholics, and so as the Polish-Lithuanian and Austro-Hungarian border moved east, the Greek Catholic Church moved east, and then when the Russian Empire pushed it back, the Orthodox Greek Catholic border moved west. So, and you know, for these people, they were simple farmers. They were more concerned about, you know, how if their cow was going to give birth all right, and if they were going to be able to gather the harvest in time, and they didn't really care. You know, they didn't know much. They didn't know anything about all of this church politics, and they didn't know anything about secular politics. It was just not relevant to village life. And it certainly doesn't mean that they were stupid. It just means that, you know, their culture was kind of outside of that. So it's, I think I mentioned there was this movie that was done in Russia.
Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors.
Yeah.
My wife and I saw it,
We watched it this
last
week.
night or this week.
This
Yeah.
weekend.
It's unnerving.
It is. It is.
He went to the camps for making that.
Really.
So,
What's it called?
Shadows of Forgotten
It's
Ancestors.
very fascinating.
Yeah.
Very fascinating.
And the only time referent in it is at the end where you see, where they're in a bar and there's a picture of Nicholas II and a clock.
I didn't think about that,
Uh-huh.
but it was outside of time. You're right.
Totally outside of
Right.
time.
Yeah.
And so that's what that kind of life was like.
I recommend it, by the way.
Oh yeah, it's an amazing film.
Yeah.
And so thousands of these people were recruited to come over and work in American coal mines and steel mills. And they essentially came over as indentured servants. Indentured servitude was one step above slavery. You had to earn your freedom. You had to earn the cost of your passage over, and of course, you had everything. You would work for the company. You would get some money from the company, and you would get credits from the company that you could buy everything from the company's store, and the debts mounted up, and so you just dug yourself into a hole. And so, you know, the slavery in the South was horrible, but this kind of industrial slavery was also horrible. And I don't know if anything like that happened in Europe. I would imagine it probably did, but anyway, so hundreds of thousands of people came over, and there was this massive immigration of these essentially Western Slavs. There's a book out, the people from the land of nowhere. They're people from nowhere about the Carpatho-Russians, which is quite interesting. And so they settled, or were settled, in all of the mining and mill towns throughout the Northeast, and in the Rust Belt. So from, from Boston on down through Baltimore, and then all of New Jersey, all of Pennsylvania, and northern Ohio, and Michigan, and into Chicago, and then all the way west to Minnesota, and then not much beyond that. But the communities pretty much stuck together. Well, I think I told you the story of the one community in Minnesota with Father Alexis Toth. That this group of Carpatho-Russians formed wherever they went, they formed churches. They were very pious, God-loving people, and they formed churches, and they were Greek Catholic churches, but there was absolutely no ecclesiastical structure here for the Greek Catholics. So they were under the Roman Catholic bishop. At that time, the Roman Catholic hierarchy was dominated by ethnic division. So that Roman Catholicism in the 19th century looked like Orthodoxy in the 20th. You had more jurisdictions. You had the Germans, you had the Irish, you had the Italians, you had the French Catholics. I mean, you had and then the Hispanic Catholics, and then varieties of those, because I don't think Mexican Catholics got along too well with Spanish Catholics, who probably didn't get along too well, And so you had literally dozens of these Catholic jurisdictions, and so for somebody coming from just fresh onto the scene, it was very confusing. Well, these Carpatho-Russian immigrants formed this church in Minneapolis, St. Mary's, approached the local Roman Catholic bishop, whose name was John Ireland, and he had his own problems, and he took one look at this great big bearded, formerly married, he was widowed, archpriest with a great big jeweled cross, and he'd been a very prominent person, dean of a seminary back in the old country, and he said, "Go away. You have no blessing to serve here. You have no blessing to have a church here. I don't want you people here. Go away." And so it was around 1888, thereabouts, significant year, that he went back to the parish council, and they approached Bishop Vladimir in San Francisco of the Russian Church, because San Francisco was the headquarters of the Russian Orthodox Church in North America, for all of North America at the time. They were received, and it began a movement of 300 parishes into what by that time was called the Russian Mission, the Russian Orthodox Mission in America, and which was the diocese, basically, headquartered in San Francisco. There was another bishop, another diocese in Alaska, subordinate to San Francisco after the sale of Alaska, and so there was this huge movement of people into the Orthodox Church, and basically it was a return of the Uniates to Orthodoxy. And it had some very interesting aspects to it. That nobody really told them that there's a difference between being a Ukrainian Catholic and a Russian Orthodox. Because at that time, Ukrainian Catholics were very significantly Latinized. They would call their priests Monsignor. They would dress like Catholic clergy. They did all sorts of strange things liturgically, and they were alien. And quite frankly, there weren't very many people in the Russian Orthodox mission in America who could teach them. There were a few, but it was not as if there was a huge movement of missionaries from Russia. And when I say Russia, I also mean Ukraine, but the Russian Empire, because that's what it was at this, you know. And it, there were some, and there were some who were very prominent, but a lot of the churches were served by circuit riders until they could get enough clergy. So there were seminaries that were established. There was one established in Minneapolis. There was one established in New Jersey in the 19th century to train local clergy, because obviously the clergy needed to be able to speak English, but they also needed to be able to relate to these people who spoke the Carpatho-Russian dialect. And it helped to speak Russian as well, if you wanted to relate to the bishop. But it was a very dynamic time in the life of the church. Not all of it good, because sometimes families were split, communities were split between Ukrainian Catholic and Russian Orthodox, and then parishes would go back and forth. And in the end, it turned into a very interesting thing. In the 1920s, the church had to reincorporate, and so the corporate name that it used was the Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church. And
That's
so,
a nice name.
so at St. Nicholas or at Jordanville, it's inscribed on the cornerstone, Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church. It's interesting. St. Tikhon's too, I'm sure.
I read that he was in America just for 2 years.
No.
No? Also, that's wrong. No, not
No.
Wikipedia, something else.
Well, we'll get there. Okay, so St. Tikhon shows up in 1897, a young bishop. He goes to San Francisco, takes up his see there, and starts traveling all over, consecrating churches and consolidating communities. But one of the problems, and that was all very significant. And he went to some really obscure places, like Calhoun, Colorado, which is out in the middle of the plains, and Wilkinson, Washington, and very interesting. But it's like, and because there were communities of Orthodox there, and through this whole period, many of the priests were Russian, but very few, up until the Carpatho-Russian influx. Most of the parishioners were Greeks, Serbs, and Arabs, Syrians. And then you had this whole influx of Slavs, but they had their own identity. And this identity, this communal identity, this ethno-communal identity, was very strong. And part of it was because of the ordeal that they had gone through. Now this is a pattern that's going to repeat itself in the 20th century with Rocor. But at that time, in the 19th century, you had there was a very strong push from the top, from Bishop Tikhon, from the bishops that he ordained and assigned to consolidate these various ethnic communities into parishes. Raphael Hallowini in Brooklyn, based in Brooklyn, but consolidating the Syrian parishes. Sebastian Dabovich consolidating the Serbian communities. He wanted to appoint somebody to consolidate the Greek communities, but the Greek communities were totally doing their own thing, and were mostly kind of totally independent. And Albanians at this time, although, and there was an immigration, but I think the Albanian history comes a little bit later, with the advent of Fan Noli, and so that's, I think, the 20s and 30s, and that's a really interesting history. But there are all these groups, but they were all united, and St. Tikhon's vision was for an autonomous Orthodox church in North America, with ministries, outreach ministries, even dioceses that would consist of ministries to all these various ethnic groups in languages that they could understand. Because the new immigrants, you know, these were not educated people for the most part. They were just simple people. They came over and they'd probably never heard English before. And so, you know, and here they were in these, you know, in these factories and in these mines and all of that, and working very hard and trying to build churches and trying to consolidate their communities and trying to keep them together. In 1906, and this continued into the first decade of the 20th century. The biggest event in 1906 was the San Francisco earthquake, and the cathedral in San Francisco was destroyed, and St. Tikhon moved the headquarters of the church to New York, and the kind of center of gravity of the diocese had moved to the east. Orthodoxy came into America from Alaska and moved east. Eventually they also rebuilt the cathedral, thanks to the money from the Tsar and the Missionary Society, in 1907, Holy Trinity Cathedral in San Francisco, it became a diocese. And part of the idea that St. Tikhon had was that the archdiocesan center would be New York, but there would be a diocese in San Francisco, a diocese in Alaska, a diocese in Pittsburgh, mainly for the Carpatho-Russians, since that was the kind of center of gravity for them. I think Chicago for the Serbs. So he had this kind of comprehensive vision, which he was working at establishing. Unfortunately, he got pulled back to Russia. You know, after he'd been in the States for about 10 years, and it was, but he'd made considerable progress and imparted a vision. And he had some really remarkable co-workers. Certainly Alexis Toth was working with him, although he was older by this time. And then Father John Kachurov and Father Alexander Hadovitsky, thank you, and Raphael Halawini. Raphael Halawini was Syrian who studied in Kazan in Russia, and was ordained by the Russians and made bishop in America by St. Tikhon, and he gathered what was the foundation of the Antiochian Archdiocese, which at the time was entirely within the Russian Church. Yeah.
So
the
who
Serbs
took over
were
from Tikhon again?
What's that?
Who took over from Tikhon?
I don't remember exactly. There was.
That's the next lesson.
Yeah, there were. Yeah. He wasn't particularly remarkable. But what happened over the next 10 years is, you know, the vision continued to kind of mature. you know, and all of these guys were, the bishops and the, you know, were continuing their missionary work. Some of them, like Kachura and Hudovitsky, got called back to Russia. But I think it was John Kachura who built the cathedral in Chicago. Father Alexander Hudovitsky built St. Nicholas Cathedral in New York. And these are huge cathedrals. I mean, they're, you know, typical Russian Orthodox cathedrals. Although the one in Chicago was designed by Louis Sullivan, so it has a unique kind of Chicago American flair. And the San Francisco Cathedral is just right out of any small city in Russia. But there was very little Russian immigration at all. A few, and many of the clergy who would come over here would only come over for a time. Now, the Russian Missionary Society that had been started by Saint Innocent, who had died, I think, in 1872 or 1877, something like that, 1870s anyway, continued, and it funded a lot of the salaries of the clergy that were, especially the Russian clergy, who were working here and working with all of these very disparate groups. The translation of the service books was the most important service book, or translation that was done called the service book by Isabel Hapgood, who was an Episcopalian lady. St. Vladimir's, we called her Saint Isabel the Episcopalian. But she translated all the, you know, the liturgy and all the major services and festal services and stuff. And those translations are still the foundation for all other major English translations. There was another guy, this was all about 1904, authorized by St. Tikhon, by the name of Orlov, who did some really funny translations. And you could tell that he got a hold of a thesaurus. And so, so what we today, for example, one of the phrases that we use, it's the opening line to one of the very common hymns that we use in one of the canons. I will open my mouth and the Spirit will inspire it. I will open my larynx and vociferate unto the Lord. It's just really funny. But he actually translated a huge amount of stuff. Unfortunately, you know,
Bring back St. Isabel, right?
yeah. Unfortunately, well, her stuff, her work superseded his, essentially. And back in the 1870s, it was used. English was being used in the cathedral in San Francisco, and they were preaching and teaching as well as serving in English. And it was being used in bits and pieces throughout, because the ethos of the Russian Orthodox mission was to convert the Americans. Now, that started out being Yupiks, Eskimos, and Native Alaskans. But, you know, the white people in California, not to mention everybody else, was just as much American as the Yupiks, the Athabascans, and so it was a very much of a missionary spirit. There was also a black priest who was ordained in the 1890s, I believe, and he was with the Greeks. So I think it was New York, but I'm not sure. That somebody, I lose track of who's doing what, but somebody's doing a doctoral dissertation on him. Yeah, because there has been, you know, there's been an outreach to the black community. There's been outreach to all these various, you know, all over. But one of the things that started happening, and it happened really partly as a result of the Russian Revolution, but the seeds were already sown, with these massive immigrations of people who shared a common identity, was exclusivism. And and so you had racism, you had ethnocentrism, you had, and not Europeans. I mean, I don't know about in Europe, but in America, every European group, tells ethnic jokes, or used to tell ethnic jokes about the others. So like when I was growing up, my father's family comes from the German community in Michigan, in southern Michigan, and all that area actually from Pennsylvania, this whole swath, like 2/3 of the country, spoke German. And America, it came down to within a hair's breadth of America speaking German instead of English at one time. But the other ethnic group in Grand Rapids, Michigan at that time were the Dutch Reformed. Were Dutch, and they all belonged to the Dutch Reformed Church. So they would tell Hollander jokes, and then Germans, being Germans, would tell Polish jokes, and then they would tell Italian jokes, and then and so all the and there was all this kind of sometimes not so good-natured kind of stuff going on between all these ethnic groups. And on one hand, what it did, it kind of reinforced ethnic identity, but it also, it kind of pointed out things that were funny, and cultural differences and all of that. One of the things in America that happened with the immigration is the degree of and speed of assimilation differed from group to group. Now the Greeks assimilated very quickly on one hand, and yet they retained their language and culture to a degree that the other ethnic groups had not.
Because they have Greek restaurants.
Well, and the church was a big part of it, but there was the Greeks came over here. They didn't come over as indentured servants. They came over here freely, and they came over to get rich and make money. And so, in order to do that, they wanted to assimilate. So, in the Greek churches, they wanted to do everything they could to make it look and sound American. It was still in Greek, but they used organs and they used Baptist choir robes, and it got Protestantized. Whereas some of the other ethnic groups, like the Russians, very, especially the later immigration, very strict adherence to the tradition of the old country. And then you had the Carpatho-Russians, which at that time, at the beginning of the century, comprised a huge proportion of the Orthodox in America. And they didn't have a national cult. They didn't have a national identity. And then by 1917, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was gone. They didn't identify with Slovakia. They didn't identify with Ukraine. They certainly didn't identify with the Russian Empire. They didn't, and the Russian Empire was gone by 1917.
They were called Rossini.
Rossini, yeah, Little Russians. And so it turned into a very kind of it became the core. 300 parishes became the core of the Russian Orthodox mission in America. Now, in 1917, you had the political events of the abdication of the Tsar in March, and then you had the call in what probably May was the calling of the Great Council of 1917, and that was an extremely important event. And the Great Council had been in preparation for years. The 1905 revolution, attempt at revolution, stopped it because they were afraid that it was going to be a more, it would be co-opted by the revolutionaries in Russia, and so it basically was shelved. Not the preparation work for it, which continued, but the plan for the actual council was shelved, and it couldn't be convoked until until they were free of the Romanov dynasty. Then the Tsar had already abdicated, and so the church was, because one of the central features of the council, among others, was the restoration of the patriarchate. And so the council was called, but it was also a kind of a, and St. Tikhon, building on his experience in America, and actually building on some of the ideas that he was exposed to with the Episcopalians, which he imported, he was one of the proponents for kind of a progressive, not today's progressive agenda, but a progressive agenda for a more, I don't want to say democratic, but a more inclusive idea of or a more inclusive idea of conciliar government of the church. Now, under the Romanov dynasty, Peter I had destroyed the patriarchate and submitted the church to a lay governor, a lay Oberprocurator, and the church and this lay Oberprocurator could even overrule the synod of bishops. So this was totally unorthodox, and that persisted until after the fall of Nicholas II, because the church, they wouldn't permit the church to go ahead and elect a patriarch, and so Patriarch Tikhon pushed for the inclusion of clergy, white clergy, in other words, married clergy, and laity in the decision-making bodies of the church. So parish councils, diocesan councils, broader councils of the church, and so this brought in a very broad cross-section of the Russian Orthodox Church, and all of this was happening with nobody suspecting what would happen in November or October. All of this happening from May through November of 1917.
Who was the initiator of the patriarchate, the new patriarch at that time?
The council. But actually the most progressive and most vocal of the bishops was Anthony Krapovitsky, who is the one who founded the Russian Church outside of Russia. He was the most progressive and towards in instituting a council. Now, there were other factors going on in the Russian Church at the time, and there were, and part of this was that the bishops realized that they had to placate some of these really progressive white clergy who were rebelling against the tradition of the church. Um, and so there were, and some of this did creep into the council, and some of it was actually voted on. So, for example, the new calendar. The Russian Orthodox Church adopted the new calendar in 1917.
Wow.
But it was that, and that's years before, that's 7 years before Constantinople. But it was never able to put it into effect because of the, it went into survival mode. But there were some things, and so it was a big thing, to start including laity in the decision-making process on parish levels, on diocesan levels, on national level, or patriarchate-wide level, and those structures are still. Those structures are still part of the Russian Orthodox Church today, because the 1917 Council radically restructured the Russian Orthodox Church.
Why did the Tsar couldn't do that? I mean, it's so strange. You need the revolution to get rid of the Tsar, to get the patriarchate coming back.
I don't know.
He wanted to do it.
But who
yeah.
won't let him?
It was just procedural. As you said, Hadika, after 1905, it became procedurally complicated. At one point, even he offered himself to be the patriarch.
Really?
Yeah, he did, Hadika.
Bizarre.
Yes. Antony Rapovitsky was present and reported that. He told Bishop Basil about this. And everybody was quiet. Nobody said a word. But he did.
Well, that wouldn't have worked.
No.
That would have been a disaster. Talk about Caesaropapism.
Well, it was a way of pushing it forward.
But it's it was that whole era in the church's life was very difficult, and a lot of people had a lot of hope in the reforms of this council and in the restoration of the patriarchate. And the two of the major candidates, and there was a third one who I don't remember. They put the names into a chalice, and I believe it was a blind monk who drew out the name of Patriarch Tikhon, who was. He was Archbishop of Moscow at the time, I think, Metropolitan of Moscow.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
And Anthony was Metropolitan of Kiev, I think. But anyway, it's very interesting. Tikhon and Anthony, and there were two major figures, and Anthony, of course, as I said, went on to form the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, our jurisdiction, and of course, and Tikhon was put into the martyric role of first patriarch of the restored church. Now, this was a huge council of as many bishops and representatives of the church in all of its various aspects and dioceses as could be convened. And so one of the things that happened was all the major leaders of the church in America were in Moscow for most of 1917. And then there was the revolution in October. And then they got stuck. And I think it was Father John Kachurov who was one of the first martyrs of the revolution, because Lenin and his band of thugs basically began killing clergy almost immediately.
Wow.
Within a week of seizing power. Which was just, there was the Civil War, and then all hell broke loose. And so it was it was a bitter thing. But the American church was decapitated. Not only was it decapitated, because all the bishops and all the leading clergy were in Russia for the council, but it had been funded by money from the Tsar and from the Russian Missionary Society. Well, that immediately stopped. You know, the Soviets certainly weren't going to fund Russian Orthodox missions. And it wasn't too long that a group of the super progressive clergy who had been at the council but had been frustrated because the bishops didn't want to go far enough, so far as they were concerned, formed a group that was allied with the communists, with Lenin and company, and it was called the Living Church, Живая Церковь. And it was very radical. They wanted to get rid of monasticism. They got rid of the of the celibate episcopate, the monastic episcopate. They wanted to pull down the iconostas and pull the altar out into the center of the church. These were reforms like Vatican II, only it was going on in 1920. So the Russian church was, was like 50 years ahead of the chaos of the 1960s.
It's Живая Церковь is the same as Обновленцы.
Обновленцы, yeah. And so the renovationists. Now, what's very interesting is you have a lot of those same themes with Mr. Denisenko and the schismatic church in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so this is ringing all sorts of historical bells in people's minds, and it's bearing bitter fruit. It got very bitter fruit. But we'll talk about Russia next week, so. But in America, some of the leaders of the church came back, and some didn't, obviously. Some it took a couple years to get back. Well, I have to talk about Russia a little bit. Okay, the martyrdom of the church began in 1917. Seizures of property, seizures of churches. It was the Civil War, and so you had the whites, in other words, the monarchists against the communists, and then you had the Bolshevik, and then the communists were divided. You had the Bolsheviks versus the Mensheviks, and then you had Trotsky and all these others, and so there was a lot of chaos going on. But all the church did was suffer, primarily. And people tried to protect the church. Patriarch Tikhon was trying to keep some measure of order, but it was, things were being confiscated. His rights. He was imprisoned, and then he was released from prison and put under house arrest, and then he aged about 30 years in a period of 5. So if you look at him, at his pictures, I mean, by 1923, 24, he's 45, and he looks like an old man. It was, and so this group of the Living Church, the Renovationists, of course, they swore allegiance to the Bolshevik government, and were recognized by the government, by the communist government, as the legitimate Russian Orthodox Church. Now, this had major implications, and major implications in America, because the properties, all the property of the church was in the name of the Russian Orthodox Church, according to the governmentally recognized state church. And it was the living church. On top of that, Constantinople also withdrew their recognition of St. Tikhon and recognized the living church.
Oh.
Oh, man.
Wow.
Yeah. So, it was a bad situation. So this thing that's brewing right now between Moscow and Constantinople, here again, it has lots of historical precedent. In 1923, there was a guy in the early 20s. There's this Greek archimandrite by the name of Meletios Metexakis, and he went around in America to the Greek communities. Now, the Greek communities, for the most part, were not within the Russian Orthodox framework, canonical framework. Most of the parishes had clauses in their bylaws saying that no bishop has any authority over this community. And they're not members of any episcopal jurisdiction. And some of those bylaws are still in effect. But he went, and at the time, there were, most of the churches the Greek churches were looking to Greece and the Church of Greece, which is autocephalous, and not to Constantinople. So, and because they could easily get clergy from Greece, which was free, as opposed to Constantinople, which was still Ottoman. And so the Greek clergy that these churches imported, because all the ethnic groups started sending back to the old country for clergy, and especially with all the chaos in the Russian jurisdiction. So by 1923, Meletios Metexakis had organized a rather substantial number of the Greek parishes, and he incorporated them as a diocese. And so he broke the unity of the Orthodox, the canonical unity of Orthodoxy in America by the formation of the Greek Archdiocese, 1923. Then, somehow, he became Patriarch of Constantinople. And he there were a couple of very significant decisions that he made, or he sponsored. He called a council. Now, there were only a couple dozen bishops that showed up to the council, and actually even Rocor had, and I'll get to that, even Rocor had a representative there. But they, because in the church in Russia, of course, didn't. They made three major decisions. One was the going to the new calendar, the adoption of the new calendar by the entire Patriarchate of Constantinople. Second was the remarriage of clergy after being divorced or widowed. Now, that decision was just renewed by the Patriarchate of Constantinople because it had not been implemented. And so a few weeks ago, they implemented that decision, essentially. And that's caused not quite as big a stir as the Ukraine issue, but it's caused a big stir. Because there's certainly not unanimity around the Orthodox world. And the third issue is not really a decision in that same way, but they came up with an interpretation of the 28th canon of the Council of Chalcedon. Remember Chalcedon, 451, that created the Monophysite controversy, or Monophysite schism? Well, the 28th canon reads, for the fathers rightly granted privileges to the throne of old Rome because it was the royal city, and the 150 most religious bishops, actuated by the same consideration, gave equal privileges, isa presvia, which means actually equal honor, equal seniority. Presvia, it's the same word as presbyter, which means old man. So it's like more seniority, privileges, yeah. To the most holy throne of New Rome, justly judging that the city which is honored with the sovereignty and the Senate and enjoys equal privileges with the old imperial Rome should in ecclesiastical matters also be magnified as she is and rank after her. Now, the Roman Church, which was the head of, which was the presiding church at the time, never ratified that canon. It rejected that canon. But
What year was that?
451,
Okay.
but what the canon essentially is doing is elevates the See of Constantinople to the same level as the papacy. Equal privilege, equal honor, equal seniority to the papacy, because Constantinople is the imperial city. Well, in 1923, Constantinople, newly renamed Istanbul, was no more the imperial city than Chicago. I won't say Washington. The fourth Rome. And this canon also granted authority of Constantinople to, or its jurisdiction over Thrace, Pontus, and Asia, which are the three counties surrounding the city, and over all the barbarians. Now,
Is that the Romans?
unsere Leute. Yeah. Basically, everybody who was not, barbarian essentially meant anybody who didn't speak Greek. It's an onomatopoetic word because the barbarians speak barbar. So varvari in Greek, barbarian English, and
That would include Russians?
well, yes, but who the barbarians consisted of in 451 is a little bit different than who the barbarians consisted of in 1923, much less in 2018. And so this canon was, had basically, it was operative during the Byzantine period, and especially after Rome itself had basically been conquered by the barbarians. Constantinople took over. But then Constantinople ceased to be a Christian city, and it ceased to be an imperial city, and it ceased to be, well, it was imperial, it was the head of the caliphate, it was the capital of the caliphate, but it certainly wasn't the capital of the Christian empire since 1453, to pick a date. So the justification for the extension of Constantinople's jurisdiction to America was based on that canon. And since that time, Constantinople has used that canon, since this interpretation by Meletios Metexakis, of sorry memory, to extend its jurisdiction all over the world, in fact, into an almost universal jurisdiction. And this is the core problem that's going on right now in Ukraine and in many other places in the world, but especially in America. Now, now there's another thing that happened in 1924. You still had the Russian mission trying to figure out how it's going to survive without foreign funding. And the new immigrants, not making very much money, weren't exactly able to support much of an ecclesiastical structure. And so there was tremendous hardship within the Orthodox communities as a result. And so what happened is the communities began to withdraw into themselves. And so they not only sent back to the old country for priests, they sent back to the old country for bishops.
Wow.
And the fundamental principle of territoriality, which is the essence of Orthodox canon law, was shattered. First by the Greek Archdiocese being formed on the territory of the Russian Orthodox mission in North America, but then the Serbs brought over their bishops. Eventually the Antiochians, though the Antiochians actually delayed as long as they could. And then the Bulgarians and the Albanians, and on and on and on and on until we have 15 jurisdictions in this country. In 1924, well, let me address something else, because that's one aspect. In 1872 in Constantinople, there was a council where they declared as a heresy the practice of ethnophilatism. Philatism, meaning organizing the church along ethnic lines. Because the basic principle of Orthodox ecclesiology is Catholicity, that any Orthodox Christian should be able to go into any Orthodox church and be a part of it, with absolutely no ethnic exclusivity.
Is there churches that have ethnic exclusion?
There's plenty of them.
Tell your story.
Well, there's plenty of them, and because in America, one of the things that happened is you had with all of these different ethnic groups and with chaos on top, they withdrew into themselves, and the church was divided into ethnophilatist divisions. It's a disaster. Canonically, it's a disaster. In 1924, Patriarch Tikhon, who was under house arrest, I believe, at the time, issued an ukaz, a decree, that all the external dioceses of the Russian Orthodox Church should organize their lives separately, autonomously, until normal communication could be established with the Patriarchate. And in other words, that the Patriarchate would be free of the domination of the communists. And so that was the essentially the founding document for the Russian Church abroad. And it was organized by the bishops who had gone into exile following the revolution and following the Russian Civil War. Most of the bishops who were who remained in Russia were either killed outright or put in the Gulag and killed there. 300,000 clergy were murdered by the communists. Clergy. And they have all the records of the trials, all the records of the executions. That's been one of the main projects of the St. Tikhon University in Moscow. So many of the exiles, the Russian, and many of the exiles gathered in Western Europe, in France, in Germany, in Serbia, and the kind of center, because they came under the ecclesiastical protection of the Serbian Orthodox Patriarch. Because there's always been a close relationship between the Russians and the Serbs, is that they were able to form an autonomous body, church body, under the protection of the Serbian Patriarchate, the Russian Church in exile. That included the bishops from North America, the bishops in Western Europe, in China, and wherever else there were bishops. But China had a large population, and all throughout Western Europe, and the Mediterranean, and particularly North America. I don't think South America at that time had many. But this was also the time of that first Russian dispersion. When thousands and thousands of people, especially who had been involved in the White Army, fled. And of course they couldn't go back to Russia because they would be shot as traitors, so they emigrated. And I don't know how many came to the United States, but it was probably several hundred thousand. And they came into the existing Russian Orthodox structure in America, which was part of the Karlovci, the synod in Sremski Karlovci in Serbia. And the American Metropolitan was a guy by the name of Platon. Of course, the situation was different in Europe than it was in the United States. In America, you had this big multi-ethnic conglomeration that was breaking apart. In Europe, you had it was primarily a refugee situation. In America, the refugees entered into the community of Orthodox. Were just one aspect of the Orthodox community, whereas in Western Europe, there were a few Russian Orthodox churches scattered around in France and in Germany, and of course there's the Serbian Church and the various Orthodox national churches that people could go to, but the exiles tended to stick together in their own communities. In some places, in Serbia, there was a little more of an integration into the Serbian Church. And so, for example, we have Bishop Basil Rdzianko as one example of this, whose spiritual father was St. John of San Francisco and Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky, and, you know, and so forth. And so the real center for church life in the, and then there was another center in Paris, and Katja can
Concern?
talk about that
No.
next week. But it was a huge Russian emigration to Paris.
Still is.
Yeah, and still is. But at that time, it was a unique community, and a unique community here. So the Russian Church continued its descent into Hades, into bitter persecution and confiscation of all the properties, the closure of all the churches, all the monasteries, the execution of most of the clergy and the monastics, and thousands of laity who were just trying to protect the church. In Ukraine, you had Stalin's famine, which killed, what, 12 million people? Holodomor? Which is completely manufactured. And it was just an evil time. And then Germany descends into Nazism in the 30s, but that's for another time. Okay. I just want to go for another couple minutes before we break. So in America, there is chaos. There is this order emerging from chaos, but it's not a canonical order. It's canonical disorder. And even within the Russian community, there's tension. And part of it's an ethnic tension, because there's a big difference between Carpatho-Russians from Slovakia and Russian aristocrats from Moscow and St. Petersburg. A huge, huge difference. There's a cultural difference, there's a social difference, there's a linguistic difference, there's an ethnic difference. You know, the Russian aristocracy, you know, mourned the murder of the imperial family. The Ukrainians probably, shall we say, didn't. You know, at all. Because and you know, it's maybe as a human story, but it had no. There was no connection. You know, it was just one more empire that was, you know, bothering their cows. So there was, in the Russian community, there were essentially two factions. Well, there were multiple factions, but there within the Slavic community. There was the Carpatho-Russian group, which was huge, and relatively speaking, and then there were the Russian exiles from after the revolution and civil war. The Carpatho-Russian group consolidated a lot of leadership within the Russian mission, and the other, you know, and the I hate to call it monarchist, but the Russian ethnic faction did, you know, it contributed some people, but it wasn't as strong as the Carpatho-Russian, and partly because they were brand new immigrants, whereas the Carpatho-Russians had been here for 40 years.
Yeah.
And so, and so there was a constant tension as to what kind of relationship should there be between the Russian diocese in America, the Synod in Karlovci, and the Patriarchate. Now, in 1925, Patriarch Tikhon died, most likely murdered, martyred, and but they don't know for sure of it. And then there was chaos. There were a number of locum tenenses who took his place, most of whom got shot. And then, about 1927, Sergei Stragorodsky, who was actually a very remarkable missionary to Japan, found himself as the locum tenens of the Patriarchal See, and he negotiated a kind of a truce with the communist government. Well, that divided the Russian community bitterly, because the Russian ethnic faction was bitterly opposed to anything that would, in any way, shape, or form, validate the communist government, because their expectation was that they would return momentarily, whereas the Carpatho-Russians, they were here to stay. They were already Americans. They were assimilated by that time. They may have, some of them, the older people may have had accents, but otherwise they were just Americans. And so there was this movement towards, in the 20s and 30s, towards to create an American Orthodox Church. And that's got a really interesting history in and of itself. But in the meantime, you had the consolidation of all of these ethnic churches in America, meaning that each Orthodox church in the world had essentially universal jurisdiction, that it could establish churches under its Omophorion 5,000, 7,000 miles away. Now, the Russians had done it canonically. All the rest is dubious, quite frankly, I think. Now, if you want a different perspective on this, ask Father Patrick Viscuso, who is he is one of the major canonists of Orthodoxy in America, and he serves here. So,
do you have a number of Russian coming to America straight after the revolution?
No, I don't have it.
Because I have the feeling and the knowledge that they mostly came after the war. Because they stayed in Europe, no?
No, after there were a lot in the 20s.
Yeah.
That came straight from
right
Russia
from
to America.
yes.
I thought there was a kind of a permission from the American. I don't know, that's what my relatives got in the 50s. There was something that they would let them come, and then it was permitted.
Right.
Maybe at the first, when they first came, it was not like that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know.
Well, it's also important
all of my relatives came after the war.
Well, it's also important to remember that there was American support for the Bolsheviks.
Yes.
Yes.
And so,
Okay.
and
Well,
governmental
both.
support.
Both. We had a brigade that was sent to support the whites.
Yeah, it was crazy.
And a lot, when they pulled out, because everything was falling apart, there were a lot that came with them.
Yeah, yeah,
They loaded as many as they could on the ships with them as they could.
yeah. So there's some incredible stories, incredible personal stories,
Oh, yeah.
and it's really worth reading some of the oral histories that have been done. A lot, of course, it's pretty moot for that first immigration now. You know, everybody's gone. But there were three.
Almost. We have like 3 people, 97 in the church.
Yeah.
Lydia, what's her last name? She's fantastic. I mean, she stays straight. She has little heels.
John Kravitsky.
Yeah.
Right.
He's almost 100.
But
There is a lot of.
okay, the revolution was 101 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. There is nothing left like that.
I mean, nobody would remember from before the revolution. Nobody left.
One or two.
One or two, maybe.
Maybe.
Well, I'd like to tell you that I had a patient in Charlottesville by the name of Anastasia
Oh, yes.
McMahon, who claimed to be
Oh, yes.
Anastasia.
Mm-hmm.
I have met her. I remember her.
That's my only
She
connection to
wasn't,
any
of
of
course.
this.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. So I said I'd bring up some things that were controversial. One of the things that's controversial is, you know, well, it's not controversial that we're in a totally non-canonical situation in America, that everything is a mess. With the multiple overlapping jurisdictions, actually what that tension that I was mentioning between the Russians and the Carpatho-Russians, who was, you know, turned eventually into the division between Rocor and the Metropolia, the OCA, which turned into the OCA, and that has a really interesting history. But initially it was one community, and so the big question now is, how do we return to a united Orthodox Church in North America, given all of this history? And because canonically it's what's demanded, that we don't have a church that's divided according to ethnic divisions. You can have ministries dealing with people in their own languages, but the church has to be a single, united, not taking, because our citizenship is in heaven. It's not in any earthly kingdom or democracy, whatever it is.
But you have those Russian Orthodox in France that belong to the Greek Church.
And that was from the
You don't
40s.
know about
I
that?
didn't know that.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
oh yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
most
that's
of
the
them
oh, yeah.
that didn't want to deal with
That's the
Oh,
Evlog-
yes,
Patriarchate
Evlog,
of
right.
Moscow.
Yeah.
yeah.
But it's been like this for a while.
Well, you had that. That was. Well, we'll talk about that next week. So, can we end? Are there any burning questions?
How to resolve all
That's
that.
the question. Your last question was the question.
Yeah. It's a really, really important question.
Yes.
And we'll probably do a whole class on the attempts to create unity in America. So, ladies, thank you very much for your patience in all of this. I hope you found it interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's pray. It is true in me to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, who without corruption gave his birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and to ages of ages.
Ispola et in